It was in the later years of the 19th century that illustrated posters advertising travel by rail and ship first began to appear. But they were in the main graphically unimpressive attempts, which usually featured equally unimpressive images of the means of travel rather than what might be on offer at the locations travelled to. And it wasn't until the 1890s when the more sophisticated graphic talents of the Belle Époque, such as Jules Chéret and Alphonse Mucha, began designing much more aesthetically considered decorative posters that the quality began to improve. But they didn't show much enthusiasm for travel themes in their work, so progress continued to be rather hit and miss, with visual promise and disappointment in roughly equal measure. There were some more imaginative posters around the turn of the century from a few other accomplished poster artists such as Adolfo Hohenstein, but most persisted with the idea that a poster was simply a painting with some words on it, and although decorative enough, it wasn't until the later years of the first decade of the 20th century that more visually considered designs began to appear in significant numbers. By this point, flatter posterised images of a distinctly more modernist nature had gained a foothold with many who understood that simpler graphic solutions could be effective in grabbing the public's attention. And there were even one or two, such as John Hassel and Willy Sluyter, who began to incorporate playful light humour into their poster designs. And it was this modernist mindset which defined many of the posters created up to the outbreak of war in 1914. And although in the main the posters created for the next 4 years continued to utilise the techniques of posterisation to considerable effect, they were now harnessed for propaganda purposes and depicted altogether different aspects of travel by air and sea. In 1919, a year after the end of the war, the first scheduled passenger flight travelled successfully between London and Paris. And predictably, just as the earliest posters had concentrated on the means of travel, this was very much the case with this airborne marvel of the age too. But by this point it was undoubtedly the portrayal of the destination that was overwhelmingly the most frequently used visual theme, and in the early 1920s, illustrators such as Julien Lecaz created idyllic, well-composed scenes to lure the French public to head by train to the splendour of French resorts. And although at first sight these images had a similar appeal to earlier painted evocations of landscape, they were actually created using highly sophisticated posterised and gradient print runs. And although he left out any human elements, such was the aesthetic quality of his scenic images, that they were highly successful in their mission. At the same time, in Italy, Mario Borgoni was exploring the seductive power of well-considered scenic images, and the series of breathtaking, dramatically composed lithographic posters he produced could only have increased the Italian public's appetite for holidays in these exotic coastal locations. Across the Atlantic in the USA, Maurice Logan was among the earliest to gain a reputation for his travel poster designs, and his images utilised varying levels of posterisation to explore both character-based and landscape scenes for a range of American destinations travelled to by the Southern Pacific Railway. By the early 1920s, many British illustrators, including Tom Purvis and Frank Newbold, were being commissioned by the various rail networks to create scenes of rural, urban and coastal locations around Britain itself and on occasion into mainland Europe. Unsurprisingly, they too had absorbed an understanding of the potency of flat-coloured, well-composed designs, and in the case of these two illustrators, they were somewhat notorious for the occasionally psychedelic palettes and collisions of colours employed. And although I've never read so, I can't help but think they were trying to outdo each other in the colour stakes. But however far they strayed from reality, they undoubtedly captured the imagination of the British public. By the later 1920s, the majority of the posters being created worldwide had manifestly embraced the idea of visual modernity in one form or another. In Italy, Giuseppe Ricobaldi was just one of many whose posters reflected the more angular execution of the then popular futurist art movement. In France, Roger Broders virtually cornered the market with a large series of manifestly Art Deco travel posters, which graphically evoked the glamour and scenic beauty of many French resorts, particularly on the Riviera. Arguably more than any other, Broders made a career almost entirely from posters which successfully incorporated languidly posed glamorous holiday makers into geometrically informed, seductively compelling landscapes. Around the same time, Belgian designer Leo Marfort took a similar and even more radically abstracted stance in his posters, although the results lacked similar levels of sophistication or engagement as those of Roger Broders. A.M. Cassandre, easily the most successful French poster artist of the period, didn't actually create all that many with a travel theme, although those he did produce were admittedly breathtaking, dynamic abstractions which pictorially celebrated the means of travel but had no place for either a human element or evocations of actual destinations. Not everyone was quite as seduced by such fashionable modernity though, and in the USA Paul Prohl was among others who continued to use more representational painting techniques to promote travel within the USA using a pleasing watercolour technique. The posters created by Leslie Reagan in the later 1920s were a little more stylised, but he promoted rail travel to American cities with positive beatific qualities. Other countries started to build and expand their tourism industries during the 1930s too. James Northfield used watercolours with great dexterity to produce evocative, colourful images of Australian wildlife to attract visitors. Posters promoting travel to India from Europe became increasingly prevalent, and even communist Russia produced images which traded on their imperial past, despite having earlier been responsible for ending it. Japan and China produced posters which were designed to promote their more attractive locations, but at this time they were confined to travel within their respective countries, rather than attracting tourism from the West. By the middle of the decade there was a level of graphic diversity not previously seen in the design of posters. Art Deco and other modernist approaches persisted and flourished, as seen in this collection from Gert Selheim for the Australian Tourist Board. But simultaneously, Ludwig Holbein was inviting tourists to Germany with a considerably more representational, if lightly posterised, watercolour style. And Britain's Charles Pears used a similar, if more painterly technique in his images of charming bathing beauties at various British seaside resorts. Travel by air had by this point come on considerably since 1919, but as yet nobody had built a passenger aeroplane which could cross the Atlantic, although the German Graf Zeppelin had successfully made that journey as early as 1928. But the dreadful Hindenburg airship fire in 1937 had a profoundly deterrent effect on potential passengers. But in 1939, Pan American Airways flew the first ever transatlantic passenger service from New York to Marseille in a Boeing B-314 Yankee Clipper. Unfortunately, this was closely followed by the outbreak of yet more war in Europe. Naturally enough, travel for pleasure was once more generally put on hold, and just like the first conflict, posters were harnessed in all the countries involved as propaganda for the duration. Once the war ended in 1945, travel by rail, sea and air began again with a vengeance. Mark von Arenberg's series of posters for Pan American pulled no punches in its determination to make the destinations look as vibrant and attractive as possible, with combinations of scenery, people and the clippers themselves using a heavily saturated colour palette that couldn't be ignored. It was at this time that more symbolic approaches started being employed to encapsulate the qualities and character of many various and frequently exotic destinations on offer, by creating decorative composite imagery, and some, such as Lucien Boucher, even use empathetic national styling. But this approach was only one of many others taken in the post-war years, and among other striking examples from this period, in 1950 Bernhill produced a series of breathtaking scenic images of trains hurtling through spectacular vast American landscapes, using a particularly well-chosen non-representational palette with the colour applied generally quite flat to enhance the sweeping lines and curves of the routes depicted. Eileen Mayo took an entirely different close-quarter finely painted approach to various portrayals of Australian wildlife, similar to those created by James Northfield 2 decades earlier, although they were considerably more stylised in their execution. A few illustrators continue to favour painted representation even now, but despite these exceptions to the rule, it was modernism of one form or another which continued to dominate. Both Adolf Triedler and Joseph Binder continued to pursue the principles of posterization established half a century earlier to great effect. And in the mid-1950s, Stan Galley created a series of brightly coloured posters for United Airlines, which, although representational, were rendered quite expressionistically and incorporated areas of pure flat colour, similar to what he and others were producing for magazine illustration and press advertising of the period. Unfortunately, despite my efforts, I've been unable to find out who created this entertaining cartoon-style campaign for Braniff Airways. But its use of humour and simplicity made for an entertaining and memorable series promoting flights to various Latin American destinations. By this point, visual brand identity in the posters advertising airlines in particular had become widespread, and American Airlines harnessed the graphic talents of Edward McKnight Kauffer, who had helped to revolutionise the posters created for the London Underground half a century earlier for this particularly geometrically styled campaign. Air France featured Jean Carlou's boldly coloured posters utilising a highly distinctive creative collision of modernism and primitivism. And although the company used others such as Guy Georget and Jack Nathan Garamond, their heavily abstracted house style persisted into the 60s with great success. Garamond was in great demand at this time and also created angular images painted with intensely saturated colour for rail travel in the country. But arguably Jean Desserrier went further than anyone else in terms of abstracted energetic styling with his series of posters for the destinations offered by Air Afrique. The stunning images created in blocks of bright non-representational colour perfectly captured the exotic and exciting possibilities for travellers. And although, as this evidence indicates, the French did produce a large amount of determinedly modernist travel posters, they were far from alone. And in the USA, by the mid-1960s, David Klein had developed a deserved reputation for the design of striking, impossible-to-ignore, stylised angular images, some of which more than gave the French posterists a run for their money. The same could be said of the series created by Harry Rogers in 1965 for the Australian airline Qantas, for which he produced flat-coloured, geometrically inclined shapes with single iconic images of human and animal characters placed on tastefully selected flat-coloured backgrounds to represent the various global locations. But despite the undoubted visual impact of these illustrated posters and others such as Jack Laycock's highly expressionistic 1970 series for Delta Airlines and this evocative winter scene by Janusz Grabianski, by this point photography had clearly overwhelmed illustration in the promotion of travel worldwide, just as it had in most other advertising. The quality of these photographic posters varied, but they were unified in their absence of both imagination and character, and soon enough they too became obsolete with the rise of the internet, where you can do a virtual tour of anywhere on the planet to see if you might like it and what you can expect of any location that takes your fancy. By the end of its life, the illustrated travel poster had managed around a century of existence, and for a large proportion of that time it had been a dominant and welcome presence on the walls of towns and cities across the world. In many ways, these images, like so much other commercial illustration, form a clear visual record of the way we were and the immense technological and social changes that took place during that 100-year period. As usual, I'm ending this overview with a selection of personal favourites I didn't manage to shoehorn into the narrative. And although naturally enough I lament and resent the passing of this immensely popular commercial art form, to end on a more positive note, I'm pleased to see that many of the examples I've shown in this video, like other posters from our collective past, are still available online as prints to hang on the walls of your home, simply for their varied and remarkable visual qualities. I know old people like me are notorious for our good old days nostalgia, but in this case it surely has to be conceded we more than have a point. It may not have been a better world back then, but it was undoubtedly a better looking one.